Yo, hello. We are back for the final Grail tier list update of 2023. Book 7 had just wrapped up, and we're due to get Book 8 very soon with a brand new Grand Hero battle and some other new skills and effects that will probably affect the list in all sorts of ways. But for the time being, there are other updates worth covering, especially from all of November, which had an absurd amount of whiplash when it came to unit viability in Aether raids, Summoner Duels, and, well, Arena doesn't really change as much. But there's still stuff worth talking about. And before we get right into the whole thing, I do want to set some ground rules real quick about how I grade them. You're free to skip to the next timestamp if you already know the rules. But for anybody new to this, hi, hello. I'm going to keep it a bit more brief. The main idea is that there are 3 tier lists based on the most common game modes, one for Aether raids, one for Summoner Duels, and one for Arena. And based on the cumulative total, which is more so determined by how high or low they rank in each tier list, will indicate which units at the end of the video I personally recommend building at this time. It is worth noting though that if you only do care for specific modes, you could always just take each list at their own accordance, but it is worth keeping in mind anyway if you do want to use them in multiple facets of the game. That being said, max investment is always considered for these tier lists, even if getting them off the ground is going to be significantly harder than a lot of the newer units. The one other thing you might notice across the video is that they're going to be these sword symbols. It just means that they're ranked with their PRF in mind and not an inheritable. And if all is good on that front, then we might as well get right into the Aether raids tier list. Aether raids had a fair amount of changes over the course of November because on one hand they decided to completely kill Catria, but they also made it so enemy phasing is a lot more difficult. And let's just start from the beginning with the Ninja banner. On the Ninja banner in particular, we got introduced to Ninja Heather, who came with Speed Defense Roost 4, which by and large completely murdered Catria and Cordelia comps in Aether raids, because not only is it really easy to inflict, but Freyr himself cannot remove that effect. The only unit and skills that can remove the effects of Roost 4 are anything with even an odd recovery, or Sarah if you could get them to HP match, but considering it's not exactly the most consistent thing, and especially in Sarah's case, you're not really going to be able to HP match all too well. It more or less just made it so you can't really use a lot of nukes that you would have otherwise been able to prior. Now, granted, you could still try and run a Catria team, but the moment you run into any sort of Roost 4, it's definitely going to become significantly more difficult to get the ground going with it. If anything, I'm just surprised they're only introducing this now and not way earlier into the game's life, but at this point, you're more or less just going to be seeing a decrease in nuking rankings just because they no longer have Catria or Cordelia to work off with. We do also have some other newer additions, whether that's for skill inheritance or the units themselves. I think if there's one unit you're definitely going to run into a lot of the time, it's probably going to be Ninja Tsunaki, not only because she has dual phase brave, but she more or less has null damage reduction, which is based on the amount of debuffs the foe and their allies within 2 spaces of them have, and the more that they do have, the less DR they get, and it's going to be relatively easy for the most part to just have that effect consistent all the time, especially if you wanted to put them on a cav line. It's incredibly free. But otherwise, we do have the addition of Fatal Smoke 4, Arcane Void, Fleeting Echo, and Speed Defense Tempo 4. I'm not going to try and pronounce her name, the one in the middle, because I'm horrible with it. But the one thing you just really have to know is that miracle shots are not going to be as consistent, because the only way you're going to be able to get some sort of miracle effect going is through the special itself. Now, granted, it does completely hinge on having Fatal Smoke 4, but similarly to Ruse 4, if it's on the field, then it's just not going to be a consistent strategy that you could take advantage of, especially since you don't have to set it up in the first combat, you just have it out of the gate. Meanwhile, with Arcane Void though, I think this is probably one of the cooler additions that we did get, although a lot of people have been writing it off as maybe not exactly the best because of how flexible it is as a weapon. I personally really like it because of how easy it is to get lethality going on pretty much any dagger unit at this point. Arcane Void has a slaying breath effect with sabotage built into it, a guaranteed follow-up, and whatever else, but the big thing in my opinion is definitely going to be the breath effect, especially if you were to tie it with Fleeting Echo and make a lot of your dagger units much more viable, especially the ones with extended range in my opinion, because going forward, I don't think it's going to be reliable to rely on something like Catria or Cordelia. I think the big thing is just going to be an absurd abundance of player phase teams, such as cav lines and flyer lines with Arian, or any sort of high range nuke. But assuming this is the direction they go in, I do think the best plan moving forward is definitely going to be along the lines of running Emblem on pretty much every season you can. Not your offense ones, of course, because you'll lose score. But the thing with defense that I think a lot of people don't take advantage of as much as they probably should is that as long as you win, there's no penalty for running pretty much any unit on those teams. And as it currently stands, I genuinely think that your best bet is to run something like Emblem on both Dark and Anima season, especially when paired with Freyr, because you can't shut her off whatsoever. You could also do the same thing with Medius if you want some sort of bolt tower protection, which can also really help for player phase strategies, but by nullifying any sort of save waves, miracle drives, anything of the sort that would make it so your foe can enemy phase with much more success. I genuinely think defense teams have gotten such a big boost at this point. You could always try and run Veil if you want to shut off a lot of stuff that would generally rely on special procs, but this is also just on the presumption that you're running into a cav line or a flyer line. Otherwise, it might be a bit more difficult to get her stuff off, but I think moving forward, especially for enemy phase strategies, she's going to be incredibly useful. Now, that being said, if you do decide to run a Gale Force team, it doesn't really matter as much because she doesn't really contribute to that whatsoever, but that wholly depends if you're able to get enough action to really secure that Gale Force strategy, because now with the new Dark and Anima defense mythics that we did get, Kvasir and Gulvig, I would argue they're probably some of the most obnoxious units we got in a long while as far as Aether raids is concerned. The former has 70% damage reduction on the first hit, which means if you do fail to double, which could be entirely possible depending on what kind of kit you're running, it's just going to hinder your Gale Force experience a lot more, except she gets damage reduction on both hits for the first combat of either phase, and it's an extremely high amount. On top of the fact that it does have Brave protection, so you can't necessarily go in with any sort of Brave unit. You're going to need some sort of piercing effect, whether that's through physical no follow or tempo 4, just to make a dent in her whatsoever. But I think the big gimmicks with them too is that if you try the enemy phase, if they so much as survive whatsoever, your team is probably going to be in a much bigger rut than it could have otherwise been, mainly because the former has triple actions on defense and has a really good amount of speed, so if you don't have the ability to kill her through any sort of enemy phase presence, then there's a good chance a lot of units can just teleport in and sweep the rest of your team. Meanwhile, Kvasir, she has a conditional Requiem dance, which just grants dance to the nearest ally who's already acted, but if that condition isn't able to be met, then she allows any unit within 4 spaces of her to teleport right next to her, which again could allow for a lot more warping shenanigans. And while I wouldn't necessarily say they're infallible, because you could always just go in with a Gale Force Fury set with AoE stuff, it's not something that a lot of units can really just take advantage of. And I think as far as Aether Raid's defense is concerned, it took a radical shift from Catria Balls and Cordelia Balls to big movement type teams. And depending on which one you go up against, it could easily prove trouble for a lot of characters. And that all happened in a span of a month. Yeah, it's a pretty drastic change overall in the landscape of Aether Raids, but that isn't to say you can't try other types of strategies. It's just going to be a lot more difficult now because of all these pre-existing units and skills at this point. But speaking of which, we have the new ones. Did you guys like that transition? I thought it was pretty bad, but whatever. Anyway, we got the Flame Emperor Refine and Flame Battle Axe, Ninja Saizo, who's basically a modern generic Lance demote, and Fargus, who ended up with a really solid PRF I was not expecting in the slightest. Let's go in order though. Flame Emperor went from a generic score bot who now doesn't really score but has an actual niche in the form of Flame Battle Axe. It debuffs a lot of attack and defense. It has built-in guard. It has a guaranteed follow-up, but I definitely think the biggest contributor to this weapon is by far the sabotage effect that has built into it. It not only makes somebody like Flame Emperor an incredibly good tank, but it also gives them utility outside of their ability to save, which is something that I think is useful for long-term viability. That being said, it's also entirely possible that some stuff just completely fails because of newer additions that come out. Meanwhile, with Ninja Saizo, there's really not much to say on the dude. He doesn't have a PRF. He's pretty much just a modern demote, but he is cool and he has a really cool animations, but that's as far as I could really give him. The most you'll ever really be doing is running him as a more modern Summer Norn, which could always just be a Lewin build with godlike reflexes, null C, or even dodge 4, give him prime 4, or you could even give him some other regular distant counter skill if you don't have prime. Stack up as much attack and speed as possible and you should be relatively good to go. And lastly, as far as newer additions go, Fargus is surprisingly good, at least on the Aether Raid side in my opinion. He has a full tempo weapon with slaying. It has warping and grants visible buffs at the start of the turn. He gets a bunch of stats and a guaranteed follow-up. I don't think you're really going to be taking advantage of the warping as much, but it could also be very helpful in situations where you have people teleporting in and getting multiple actions. So that way you could potentially trap enemies or make it easier to get kills for units that would have otherwise struggled on other fronts. I think as far as his weapon is concerned, it is a prime weapon for something like Aether Raids. His stat line definitely could have been better, and I am a bit worried that at times he may overshoot a kill and just miss the ability to Gale Force, but it will wholly depend on what season you bring him to. Sometimes he may not even necessarily overshoot but miss the double, but outside of those flaws specifically, I would say he's a really solid Aether Raids unit. Other units that are probably worth mentioning here includes Kronia, who doesn't die for some odd reason. I think I demoted her last time, and I'm bringing her back up again because Fatal Smoke means no miracle worries whatsoever. You could still run the whole Brave Robin set with Lethality and Spiral 3. You don't necessarily need Spiral 4 because it's a bit redundant, but you do get 5 extra points of damage if you wanted to try that. The only thing you're just going to have to worry about is Hardy Bearing, but otherwise, I think she could still do a very solid job at Vantage Sweeping, especially now that she doesn't have to worry about Miracle Shenanigans, which at the time was still a pretty decent soft check for her. The other units that are also worth mentioning in terms of promotion are Winter, Bruno, Cecilia, and Jafar, and the main appeal of this is definitely the arcanes that they both have. Both of them have a decent stat swing when it comes to debuffs, especially Arcane Void, which has Sabotage built into it. I think the big thing though is that it also has Breath built into both of the weapons, which means you don't necessarily have to give up your B slot for something like Special Fighter, which, while definitely not the worst thing by any means, definitely put a harder cap on their ability to tank. You could still try and run a similar set with Arcane Nastron and Special Fighter 4, but the difference between that and running somebody like Cecilia, Bruno, or even Jafar is their B slot flexibility on top of their ability to run Miracle and charge it extremely fast. And because of that, I ultimately decided to promote all 3 of those while demoting the bow armors in particular. Maybe if they get something similar in the future, I could definitely see them coming back up, but for the time being, I think the Miracle builds are definitely going to be a lot more consistent, especially for armor tanking. Outside of the Felix and Ignatz demote, I also demoted Garen and Enna, mainly because their enemy phase presence is definitely going to be a lot more questionable now that we have Gulvik and Kvasir. Their whole thing is that they would have to rely on some sort of piercing support, which means they would have to give up some sort of ability to tank. Not exactly the best thing in mind when it's entirely possible that they just get one shot by both of them. The most you would have to do in this scenario is run some sort of Veil support, but that's only for Astra season. And I definitely do think you could still make them work in their own respective way, but for the time being, I don't think they're going to be nearly as reliable as they once were, just because of the 2 new additions that we did get. I will say though, now with the existence of Ruse 4, it means they don't have to necessarily take Brave attacks as often, which is incredibly useful in its own respective way too. But outside of that, I have a Dean promotion in Arcane Void. I think outside of the ability to charge Lethality very consistently is that they have access to Fleeting Echo and Sight Attack Speed, which means they could get a pretty decent stat swing from there. On top of their access to Flared Spear and Brash Assault, the guaranteed follow-up does stack in its own right, so in a scenario where you do have to go up against a follow-up denial thing, you could still double. It doesn't really work against no follow-up and faster units, but survivability and damage output wise, he's significantly better than he once was. But other than that, the only reason I'm promoting the bulkier infantry axes is mainly just for the idea of trying to enemy phase with some damage reduction in mind, because the one thing worth highlighting is that Kvasir and Gulvik do not have piercing in the slightest. So as long as you're able to shrug off one attack, you could always instantly retaliate with a bonfire or any other sort of special that does a good amount of damage and completely kill them. As far as the long term goes, it will ultimately depend on the map, but as long as you have some sort of cooldown support, whether that's Asker or Brave Robin, preferably the latter just because he also grants stats, then it's entirely possible that you could try an enemy phase with them. And lastly, I promoted Bath Camilla and New Year Air for the same reasons as Dean. They have access to Arcane Void, can charge Lethality pretty well. Their flyer benefits can still work on a flyer line with somebody like Arian. The big thing though is that depending on what kind of season you're running it on, you will have to also watch out for somebody like Veil who could shut off Lethality strats extremely easily. That's why you could also run Blue Feud, which is pretty useful in its own right. It does mean giving up on a bit more damage output, but otherwise I do think they're pretty much going to be following a similar suit to Dean. I personally prefer Dean's innate movement more, whereas these two would have to run somebody like Arian, which could still be shut off by any sort of warp. But for the most part, I think they can make do. And as far as the Aether Raids list is concerned, that is about it. Next, we have the Summoner Duels changes, which is not going to be as much in the grand scheme because a lot of the newer additions were going to be much more apparent in something like Aether Raids. There's still stuff worth talking about in my opinion. Flame Emperors, Refine, Ninja Saizo, and Fargus. The latter two I don't think are going to be as prominent, but you could definitely put them on some sort of Brave Soren team, or even with the new Captain skill, you could try and run it that way. I think Fargus in particular having full tempo is especially useful for shutting off any sort of specials. The only ways they're going to be able to get a special off him is either by having it fully pre-charged or if they have tempo themselves, which may become more common over time, but for the time being, you can definitely make him as a decent enough near save. Meanwhile, with Ninja Saizo, you're pretty much just going to be running the same thing more or less as a lot of the other units of his caliber. You stack up as much attack and speed as possible, you give him Arcane Lewin, give him damage reduction, finish, and pledge, and he should be good to go there. Meanwhile, with Flame Emperor, I think this is where the sabotage effect might be a bit more inconsistent depending on the map, of course, because it is a ploy effect. You could still definitely make it work, but I think the effects are going to be much more apparent in usage is by far the amount of debuffs the weapon has on top of the guard effect, which depending on the type of Hinoka you go up against can definitely act as tech. You would have to run Savalin Shield because otherwise they just get completely murdered, but with the amount of debuffs the weapon has on top of guard, it's going to be much harder for her to charge up Deadeye because she does rely on the breath effect. But just as a side tangent, if you do run into an AoE Hinoka, then there's a good chance your Flame Emperor is just going to die anyway. It's not foolproof, but it's definitely something you could take into consideration. But for Wind Claude in particular, the one thing I definitely want to highlight at the moment is the ability to counterattack so that you can consistently loop something like Aegis or Sacred Cowl. The former are definitely more consistent against Claudes that have the guard effect in their Sacred Seal or any sort of support somewhere. The idea is that you would take a first hit from Claude, which would usually be a lethality, counter back and recharge your defensive special, and then tank the second one. The speed stacking would more so apply to Honoka since Claude doesn't have a capped amount in his weapon, but the distant counterattack will only work against him, mainly because he doesn't have a fire sweep effect built into his weapon. And while Honoka will definitely prove trouble, especially for somebody like Murdoch, I do think the ability to counterattack is extremely useful right now, which is why I ended up promoting Murdoch back to solid. But if you are worried about their survivability anyway, you could still run units like Veil, Maria, and Summer Ymir, or even regular Ymir. The big thing is really either just granting damage reduction or miracle in some capacity while also being able to contribute in the mode itself. These three units are generally the more popular options when it comes to that kind of role. But otherwise, it's a lot of other similar additions. We do have attack res tempo with Fire Flood Boost 3, which basically could do another similar gimmick in denying specials. And I do think once we get a better variant of boost, that's when it's going to become a lot more apparent in viability. But for the time being, it's something worth keeping in mind. But otherwise, again, it's going to be Fleeting Echo, Speed Defense Tempo 4, and Arcane Void. Fatal Smoke is also worth highlighting in its own right because it also shuts off any sort of miracle strat that wasn't necessarily from a weapon, but now you can have it just for the extra insurance. But in other news, being in armor in Summoner Duels is extremely difficult right now, especially for the top tier ones because nuking is just out of control. And because of that, a lot of people have taken the route of just running Miracle instead, and by doing so, you are able to survive a lot more consistently, assuming that you're able to charge it. It will take a lot more to get going for a lot of the melee armors who aren't able to counterattack or charge it on its own, but for somebody like Cecilia, who not only has a decent enough stat line, but access to Arcane Void and is 2 range, you're more than likely going to be able to charge Miracle much more quickly, especially with the free B slot that you could use for something like Guard and added damage reduction or whatever the case might be. I think at this point it's relatively on par, if not at the same level, but this is more so by Grail standards. Otherwise, you do have Gangrel, and he was more so promoted because of his access to Arcane Void. He has Speed Defense Tempo and Fatal Smoke, so at the very worst, you could throw him on the Catria Ball, and he should be able to do a decent amount of work with it. I'm fairly certain he's due for a refine relatively soon, so you might want to hold off until that point. But for the time being, you could definitely use a set like this and go wild on the Catria Ball. Meanwhile, in terms of other demotions, I ended up demoting Finn, not necessarily because the merits of him and his weapon are necessarily failing, but I think at this current time, some of those maps aren't exactly the most cav friendly, and for the ones that could definitely take advantage of it, you're definitely going to need a lot more than just the ability to potentially quad, especially in a DR heavy meta where he doesn't have any sort of shred ability, he doesn't exactly have the best retreat options, and the moment he goes in, he's more or less just going to be picked off after. You will also have to rely on somebody like Desert Lind if you want to get a lot of these teams going. This is what most cav line comps rely on at this point, especially with Duo Dagger or Wind Dagger. On top of using Brave Kron, it's a lot of overlap and necessities that don't really flow with him whatsoever, and hopefully in the future there will be something that allows him to function at a much higher level, but for the time being it isn't exactly the best. You could at the very least try and throw him on a Soren comp since he does have Dual Phase Brave, but as far as his killing prowess and defensive pressure is concerned, I don't think it's nearly as strong as a lot of the other options that we do have. And of course I ended up promoting Bath Camilla and New Year Air for similar reasons as the Aether Raids one. They have access to Arcane Void, Flared Sparrow, Brash Assault, Fleeting Echo, very solid skill accessibility overall, on top of Soaring Guidance, which can be used for additional utility. And lastly, I ended up demoting a lot of the Red Tome Cavs and Scion Nana, mainly because they continue to fall behind, they don't have access to any sort of piercing, and especially for the Red Tome Cavs, being a Cav at this time isn't exactly a good thing, given that a lot of the maps tend to be extremely anti-Cav. But as far as Summoner Duels changes go, I don't think there were as much comparatively to Aether Raids, but there was definitely stuff worth talking about. And lastly, there is the arena changes, which we ended up getting 2 pretty decent March projects in Fargus and Ninja Saizo, the former especially since he has a PRF and will more than likely age better when we get more score creep. Fargus is tied with 4 other units for the highest scoring scoring free-to-play units in the game, while Ninja Saizo scores 760 points because he is a modern lance infantry. I don't think you could go bad with any of them whatsoever, but I do think Fargus will definitely offer a lot more utility and viability just because of his PRF alone. Meanwhile, with Flame Emperor, they used to be a really good score bot, and now they aren't, and that just has to do with how old they are. And at this point, only with a PRF, they score the same as Marla, who isn't exactly a good merge project to begin with. So that should really more so put it into perspective. You can definitely bring them if you want to, but I don't necessarily recommend it. Though if you are like me and have also built them up at the time for arena scoring purposes, you can bring them to Water Season. Same thing with Fargus and Saizo, because I think their innate color and skill accessibility are incredibly useful, given that Water Season is made up of a lot of blue units. Granted, that's not every single water legendary, but a good amount of them are, on top of the fact that there aren't really a lot of prominent red or green units, so as far as their combat is concerned, they're probably going to be doing a lot better there. Flame Emperor I would probably make into a near save, simply because I think they're going to be much better at that role. Not to say they couldn't far save, but with legendary Chrom roaming around, it's entirely possible that they just get one shot, although it will ultimately depend on the set. Meanwhile, with Saizo and Fargus, I would probably recommend running some sort of distant counter skill with any sort of ability to either soak damage or output a good amount of damage. Fargus doesn't really have access to damage reduction properties, so he would want to run some sort of unit that could provide it to him. But he does have the ability to grant everybody warp within 3 spaces and slang, so you could always instantly retaliate with a Ruptured Sky if needed and deal with a lot of the ranged threats. On top of the fact that he has a pretty high amount of defense, so I wouldn't worry about taking physical hits there. Ninja Saizo is definitely going to be a much better tank, assuming there isn't any sort of pre-charged Deadeye, lethality, any of that. But he doesn't really do much outside of that. Although definitely outside of the more modern water legendaries, we also have units like Legendary Dimitri, who just got his remix. He has a lot of shred, so he could still go through stuff like Ninja Saizo or Flame Emperor if they are running damage reduction skills. You also have Legendary Crumb, who also got a remix and still scores relatively well on its own accord. And the big thing is definitely just his movement capabilities because of To Change Fate 2. Otherwise, it's just going to be a lot of the modern water legendaries, including Legendary Ninian, who has a fire sweep effect against anybody who is blue or debuffed, but she doesn't have any sort of piercing, and she's not going to be able to run any sort of low cooldown special, so I wouldn't worry about her all too much. But as far as arena changes are concerned, that's really going to be about it, since there weren't really any newer additions to arena this month. And as far as my recommended units go, it's more or less just going to be the same as last month, except now with the addition of Fargus and Flame Emperor, I think they provide a good amount of stuff that makes them worth building or considering for certain modes. Flame Emperor has a sabotage weapon with a lot of debuffs, a guaranteed follow-up and guard. It's a very solid refine overall. Meanwhile, with Fargus, he scores extremely well, and he has a pretty decent enough niche in something like Aether Raid's offense, but you might find that his stat distribution could hold him back at certain points. I ended up pairing Cyril with him and Eldigan with Larm, just because they're more or less ranked with the same intent in mind. Eldigan is just an older Larm who is a bit slower and has a completely different stat line, but they're more or less going to be doing the same thing. Cyril has a much better Summoner Duels focus, whereas Fargus has a much better Aether Raids focus, and both of them score extremely well in their own respective way. And Murloc is also in a similar boat where he does very well in something like Arena due to his high scoring, PRF, and armor capabilities, but depending on the type of team and allies that you do have, he may end up succeeding or failing in certain areas in Aether Raids or Summoner Duels, but has a pretty decent ceiling as is. And if you had to build any Grail unit at this time, I definitely recommend any of these 11. But that's just me. Maybe this will change entirely within the coming month of December, and all these units may end up proving completely unviable whatsoever. But who knows? This game is extremely volatile. At that point, you may as well just build whoever you want. But if you are looking for some recommendations, I would definitely recommend them. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. If you have any other comments or concerns or feedback, leave them in the comments and I'll get to them as soon as I can. But until then, I'll see you later.